Hello, I'm Steve Sedgwick, and a warm welcome to CNBC's Internet of Things Powering the Digital Economy debate. The debate today is about assessing global progress and the priorities for achieving net zero. We'll be reflecting on the latest report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been coined a survival guide for humanity, and discuss how exactly we can keep global warming under the all-important 1.5 degrees Celsius target. We'll assess the progress being made by governments and businesses globally when it comes to setting and implementing net zero targets, and how we measure those targets to ensure they are credible and achievable. It's also about mobilizing the capital needed to get us there, how we can scale up investment into clean energy technologies, whilst also reducing overall energy demand. And with the narrowing window of time to turn the tide on climate change, we will evaluate what options we have to keep the world on track to reach net zero by 2050. Will it be enough? I'm going to be joined a little later on by a great panel of guests to debate these topics. But first, I'm delighted to be joined by Gwenaëlle Avis-Huet, who is Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Schneider Electric. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, look, it's been a momentous time in recent days looking at the latest assessment report, the synthesis report from the IPCC. Very open question. What did you make of it?
Well, you know, these IPCC reports, in fact, explain what the future will look like. And in particular, it says that nobody will be spared, meaning that everybody will be hurt by the global warming. And therefore, for me, it's a wake-up call. It's a call for action. We need to act doing everything everywhere that we can. And in particular, solutions already exist. So it's not just waiting for new solutions. It's just implementing existing solutions.
You made an absolutely key point there. There are solutions at hand already. There is technology at hand already, which will make this transition easier. Why are we not seeing greater adoption if the solutions are already with us?
Very good question. In reality, when it comes to decarbonization, people are thinking about renewables, for example. And this is absolutely critical to develop renewable, like wind, solar, etc. This is absolutely critical, but it's only part of the equation. If we want to solve climate change issue, we need to work on the demand side, meaning reducing the demand, meaning electrification. And on that front, people are not thinking right away about the solutions. Why? Because it's relying a lot about digital. And digital is something that you cannot perceive. It's not like solar or wind. You know exactly, you can perceive what's a wind farm, etc. For digital, we need to make that visible, even though it's not visible. This is how it can make a huge difference.
The IEA has talked about trillions of dollars worth of capital needed to get to net zero. Do you think more of that money now is being directed to, as you say, buildings and looking at the demand side and conservation rather than just thinking purely about renewables?
I think that we need to go 3 times faster if we want to solve this equation and to go into a more, meaningful trajectory and being in line with the 1.5 degree scenarios. What makes me also feel a little bit nervous is that when it comes to investment, that's not only investments for developed countries, these should be also investments for developing countries.
But Gwenaëlle, this sounds like an old problem, a problem that's come up at every major COP conference, i.e. how do developed nations help the emerging nations along the way, despite the fact that it was obviously the developed nations that have created most of the carbon emissions that we have in our atmosphere as well. This is an old problem. Do you have hopes that actually COP28 later this year can make some progress on that front?
You're absolutely right, and I think that's why companies should step in. It's not only discussions at governmental level, it's also investments from corporates into developing countries to help them take off. And that's why, we have been committed at Schneider Electric to have 50 million people across the world, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, to get access to reliable electricity by 2025 through our action. And we are developing technologies for that. We are not just deploying projects. We are developing technologies to grant them access. So that's why when it comes to the COP, my conviction is that the best hope that we can have is to showcase what concretely companies are putting on the table as concrete solutions, as concrete impacts for those geographies.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. You talk about the collaboration between companies and the developing, emerging world as well. But the other key collaboration has to come from government, has to come from these big international organizations as well. Have governments been lacking in their leadership?
Well, so many things happened in the past few years. In reality, things are moving quite fast. For example, in the United States, with the Inflation Reduction Act, that will put like hundreds of billions into the energy transition, in particular on microgrid, on electrical vehicle, etc. And on the other side, the new industrial policy in Europe, in order to foster new technologies for the energy transition. So I wouldn't say that governments are not acting. On the contrary, I think that there is a good complementarity between what governments are discussing and implementing right now on their perimeter, and in addition to that, what companies are doing in terms of investments. We just need to pull all that together in a more strong way, because at the end of the day, again, in this climate change, we need a lot of collaboration, partnership. It's not just alone that we will solve the equation.
In terms of what Schneider is doing in its own ecosystem as well, you rank very highly in terms of the most sustainable companies on the planet as well. Is there a Schneider model that you think actually can be replicated elsewhere, or actually are bespoke models the way forward?
I think that what makes us so well positioned, as you rightly say, is that we started a journey on sustainability like 15 years ago. So there is a high level of maturity in the culture of the company. When you look at our people, they think sustainability first in everything that they do on a day-to-day basis. So when we develop a product, we think sustainability. When we engage with clients, we think sustainability. And I think that this is a key differentiator, because it does not happen in a day. Like, because we decided to go into sustainability, it's a 15 years journey. And I used to say that sustainability, it's like a marathon without a finish line. We are always trying to reinvent ourselves, because we want to stay ahead of the game, because we want to differentiate, and in particular say that we are an impact company. Impact company, meaning that we are not only acting on our own, scope and our own offers, etc., but trying to influence on the upstream with our suppliers and the downstream with our customers. This is how we can have meaningful impact.
Gwenaëlle, we started this interview talking about the wake-up call that is the recent synthesis report from the IPCC as well. From the reaction that you've seen to that report as well, given all the other challenges you've mentioned that are going on in the world and will always be going on in the world, there'll always be some other problem that needs solving as well. Do you think the message is being heard, or do you think actually it needs to be amplified even more?
Never enough, I would say. We always need to amplify this message, just to make sure that wherever you are, whatever companies you're working with or whatever entity you're working with, you get to point. This is time for action.
Gwenaëlle, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and thank you for getting up so early for us to speak to us today. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure shared.
Before we get to our esteemed panel, here's a short film to give a little bit more context and frame the debate.
As the world faces a climate crisis, commitments to reach net zero are growing. Pledges to slash emissions have been unveiled across the public and private sector in recent years. More than 100 countries have set or are considering a net zero target, as have a third of the world's largest companies. This means that 80% of the global population is now represented by targets. But are these net zero objectives ambitious and robust enough to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees?
Sustainability is the challenge of our generation. Whether it's education, whether it's equity, whether it's health, whether it's food, are all going to be dramatically affected by what happens with the climate in the coming decades.
As target-setting momentum grows, the spotlight falls on the 65% of companies yet to announce pledges. And with major credibility gaps in both corporate and national targets, the UN warns we could be on track for a 2.8-degree temperature rise by the end of the century.
Credibility is a really big issue. It's not enough to simply make a target. It has to be scientifically based transitions, and those have to be, as we said, measurable, credible, accountable and trackable.
This dangerous trajectory has been exacerbated by the global energy crisis, which threatens to derail climate policies. And although the uncertainty around fossil fuel supplies has accelerated the transition to renewables, the IEA estimates we still need over $4 trillion in clean energy investment a year by 2030.
There is enough money, enough capital. But what is missing, in my view, is the international political will.
At the end of the day, when you really take a step back, capital goes to where the returns are. And in this new energy mix, where is the capital going to go, both from a supply side and the demand side? We need to start focusing on energy efficiency as well. Can we use AI technologies to drive energy efficiency? Can we use AI to drive uptime in machines?
With the release of the IPCC's latest climate report, it's become clearer than ever that we need an urgent and comprehensive global effort to turn the tide on the climate crisis.
We are not investing enough in one another. What we do need is the leaders in our political systems, but also in our economy, to put their money where science is telling us we not only have to be, but there are opportunities.
From policymakers to the private sector, do we have the collective willpower to follow through on our net zero commitments at this critical point in our planet's future? Welcome to CNBC's IOT, Powering the Digital Economy Debate, as we focus on assessing global progress and the priorities for achieving net zero.
We have a brilliant panel today, and to help us digest the actions so far, where we're at on climate and what we can do going forward, which is absolutely important. What a great panel we have for you. We have Angela Wilkinson, who is the Secretary General and CEO of the World Energy Council. We have Jussi Hellin, who is Vice Chairman of the Board of Kone Corporation as well. Andy Griffiths, he joins us as the Head of Sustainable Procurement over at Diageo. And last but by no means least, Mark Dooley, Global Head of Green Investment Group at Macquarie Asset Management. So, a lot of expertise, and hopefully you'll bring us a lot of examples from your own entities, corporations, companies, of what you're doing and what you believe needs to be done. But first, on the situation now. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, says this report is a clarion call to massively fast-track climate efforts by every country and every sector and on every time frame. Let's start off with Angela Wilkinson. Angela, really lovely to see you. And as the Secretary General of the World Energy Council, you have a unique perspective of where we've come to so far. Why don't you give us your view on where we've come to and what your impressions were of the IPCC report?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, World Energy Council, we've been looking at energy transitions for the last 100 years. But this is a different moment now because we are facing the challenge of what we call global energy transition because of the climate emergency. And as you said, the recent IPCC assessment report is sobering. It shows that climate momentum is continuing to build. That means the emissions are growing. And there's going to be a global stocktake of action in the run-up to the COP28 meeting. And that's going to show we're well off track. And that's why you're seeing the Secretary General of the UN making this clarion call. And of course, the gap between ambition and impact is action. So this is a call to action. So the challenge with the call to action is we see the importance of collaboration being stressed. We're seeing the importance of building and maintaining multiple, what we call clean technology bridges. And we're seeing calls now to use all levers, right? Not just a single best solution to make things happen, and also to use nature-based solutions. We can dig into what all this means. But what's really missing, and what I liked about the new flavour of the IPCC report, is this call to say, well, actually, what's really missing from the whole picture is people and communities. And how do we get them involved? How do we help them understand their roles and their choices? And how do we make those options easier for them?
I appreciate the World Energy Council is a huge encompassing organisation as well, but you represent a lot of very traditional fossil fuel producing nations who have reliably, and that's a very important point, reliably, part of the old energy trilemma that I'm sure will come up in this debate, provided energy to the world as well. But are those nations willing to move ahead with the transition as much as those nations who are consuming nations, as much as those Pacific Island nations, as much as those who are pushing more aggressively for renewable sources at the expense of fossil fuels? Are they finding the path forward very difficult?
Well, we're a mission-aligned organisation. You don't come to the World Energy Council table unless you are interested in pushing, right? You can go somewhere else, go to an industry association if you don't want to be progressive. But we have to be realistic. I don't mean realistic as in excuse inertia or not be responsible. But if we really are going to, we've been running an electrification revolution for 110 years, right? We need to get electrification going faster. We want it to be more renewable powered electrification, but we mustn't be too we can't let perfection be the enemy of the good in this, right? The reality is, to get renewables to scale, we're going to have other clean energy friends in the mix. We're going to have to build multiple clean energy bridges. We're going to have hydrogen lifting. We're going to have gas with CCUS lifting. We're going to have grid strengthening going on. So it's not that it's a simple issue of just swapping out one technology for another technology. It's a much more complex challenge than that. And all our members are interested in playing a role.
Let me talk to the man who's representing the money on the table as well, Mark Dooley, Global Head of Green Investment Group at Macquarie Asset Management. Mark, you've been in this business a long time now, looking at where the money is going, where the money isn't going. Is the kind of money that Fatih Birol and others and the IPCC are talking about, the trillions of dollars, is it finding its way into the process to create net zero, or is it just too slow?
There's reason for great encouragement in what we've seen happen in the last year. But we've just had our first year in 2022 where we punched through $1 trillion going into the energy transition, $1 trillion. Now there are plenty of authorities saying that needs to quickly escalate to $4 trillion, which is a dizzyingly large amount of money as an annual spend. But again, if you break that down, and Angela's comments about the different kinds of investment that we require, it's actually a lot of different categories of activity drawing on lots of different sources of capital. A lot of that $4 trillion is transmission grid, a very large portion of it. That comes from one range of sources of capital. A lot of it is individuals choosing to buy electric vehicles. And taking other measures. And yes, a lot of it is about big projects, the kind of thing that lies at the center of the business that I look after. It's a tall order, but the feeling that we have, the experience we have, is that the investor appetite to be part of this transition is enormous. It's not only there for the established technologies, the wind and the solar. There is real investor appetite, I think, driven by their investors' own stakeholders, their pensioners, for example, wanting to be seen to be leading this transition. So there's also appetite there for the newer technologies. So we are very much impressed by the scale of the task in front of us, but there are a lot of very encouraging signs that the money will be there. As soon as we can produce the projects, and that the real speed limit is on achieving investable projects to apply that money to.
What did the IPCC report say, the synthesis report? What did it add to your hopes that actually they're looking in the right direction, that money's going to be invested in the right way, rather than, I mean, look, there were some pretty scary headlines. I went through some of them as well. We're already going to get to 1.5 degrees C within the next decade or so, according to the report. So what was there in the report that you were heartened by or concerned about?
Well, look, the first thing to say is we regard the IPCC to be the closest thing to a definitive analysis. And it's essentially, as we've said, it's a wake-up call, another wake-up call. So maybe not a lot of good news in it, but the more nuanced messages coming through are, this isn't binary. Every additional decimal point of global warming that we have has a consequence, has an identifiable consequence. So we need to fight for every one of those decimal points, avoiding each incremental decimal point. I think the other nuance that's there is, even if we push through these limits that are being set, there's then a whole other agenda about how quickly we get that back. And direct air capture, carbon capture, and nature-based solutions are going to be a huge part of that. So it's a spur for us to be driving forward with those technologies and those investments.
Thank you, Mark. You see, I saw you nodding as well. Look, Kone already targeting 40% reductions in GHGs, raw materials and lifetime of products, 50% in terms of your own operation cuts, and that's by 2030 as well. Again, what did the IPCC add to the... What did it add to the impetus from your own company and your own ecosystem? And again, when I say ecosystems, we can talk about where you get your energy from, scope 2s, and we'll move to scope 3s later on. But what extra impetus did it add in your mind, sir?
We operate in the urban environment, in the urban setting, and we move the equivalent of 1 billion people every day. So you know, that's our context, that's our playground, and thus we believe that, you know, creating sustainable cities is a huge part of creating sustainable life. And you know, when you think about the fact that for up to 40% of greenhouse gas emissions are connected to the built environment, and how little has happened in the efficiency improvement of construction industry in the last 20-30 years, there's a huge opportunity for let's say the ecosystem that we operate in, the construction and the urban ecosystem. There's so much still to do, and that's just on the construction efficiency side. Of course, looking at Europe, there are studies saying that of the buildings that we will be needing in 2050, up to 95% have already been built. So that's the other big deal. The other big focus areas that we have to focus extremely hard on, how to modernize and repurpose the buildings that we already have, so that they're fit for the future, that there's better energy efficiency. But really the problem is, of course, well, there are a couple of problems. One is that it's an ecosystem, so we need even more collaboration between companies, between countries, between public and private side. And there are a lot of things happening in the world right now, or in the past couple of years, that have been really counterproductive to international collaboration and collaboration between economies and companies. So I think that's a very worrying sign.
Yeah, in fact, you've raised a brilliant point, which I'll come back to in a moment. So it'll be, my next round will be about collaboration and who's moving ahead regardless of the politics. But I want to get to Andy as well. Andy, I've got a confession to make. I spent a lot of time working on this with a big drinks rival of yours. And one thing they said to me is there are bespoke solutions in the multitude of countries, the multitude of suppliers, the multitude of the procurement options they have as well. And I'm sure it's something you absolutely echo, that actually for a company like Diageo, and I think Angela's already made the point, there isn't a perfect one-fits-all solution. For someone like Diageo, you've got to work with what you've got in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if you look at the landscape we're looking into, the solutions and challenges can be very regional. So it really is about how we identify the right partners, the right propositions to work with and build, leverage, and assess the impact of those opportunities. What's really important is we do that at scale and at pace, but accept that there is an element of test and learn as we go through that process as well. But as we go through that process, particularly where we have organisations like ourselves have that global footprint, we can leverage those insights to best effect and transfer them to other markets where they're relevant. So that's played through really well from our perspective, and something that we're really focused on going forwards. And it means that we can also start to drive investment into those locations where perhaps there hasn't been the same level of investment previously, to help level up the opportunity and drive real change with those communities and other sectoral players.
In terms of the IPCC report, before we move on to the next round as well, Andy, what does it mean for Diageo?
So I think it's been really interesting, to the earlier point, a real clarion call in terms of the need for rapid acceleration in terms of investment and collaborative action. I think for me, though, the one key element is it's really helped shine a light on the shared interests and dependencies of different players globally. So for me, it provides a real opportunity or kind of reason for hope in terms of how different organisations can come together on the basis of those shared interests to really accelerate that change.
Brilliant, thank you. Look, we've already touched upon politics and the problems globally that there are. And we know there are all kinds of just problems in Europe, problems trans-Pacific and elsewhere as well. But Mark, regardless of the politics, regardless of what is being done at a country-led level, at a governmental level as well, investment has continued. And one thing I was heartened at is, despite it going from Obama to Trump to Biden and the oscillations that brings as well, actually the investment's been pretty consistent. In fact, if anything, it's accelerated now. Can the money find a home and find a smart home, Mark, regardless of the politics?
One of the most encouraging things that's happened in the last few years, Steve, is the drive from the corporate world, and we've got two corporates represented here manifesting that, has detached itself from policy, from government policy to a certain extent. Corporates, driven by their sense of accountability to their stakeholders, to shareholders, to consumers, to the communities they operate in, are driven by their net zero commitments, which a huge proportion of them have now made, are very galvanized to be active on their journey to sustainability, to net zero. And that's manifesting in demand for the kinds of projects and the electricity and the clean fuels that come off the kind of projects that we do. So, we've done projects with Amazon Wireless Services in India, with Holcim, the cement manufacturer in the Philippines, Bosch, auto goods in Malaysia, Danone in Poland, and one of my favourite stories, Norsk Hydro, an aluminium smelter headquartered in Scandinavia. But with them, we're building a 450 megawatt onshore wind farm in Brazil. So here's an aluminium business which is very intensely a user of electricity, choosing to be a leader in the sustainability transformation and causing us to do a project that is facilitated and affected by government-driven permitting guidelines and grid access. But economically, that's happening in the private sector. And I can tell you that just groundswell of appetite, groundswell of determination to be on a net zero journey is a huge driver of investment. And that is going to carry a lot of what happens in the established technologies forward for the decades to come. The government intervention needs to happen in the newer technologies.
And Angela, I mean, look, we've already said with collaboration, things could be very, very exciting. When governments actually do something exciting like IRA in the United States, my goodness me, that gets everyone else thinking, well, what can we do? And I thought the European reaction was wonderful. First of all, they're saying, right, we're gonna see whether this is anti-European companies. And then they thought, no, we need to compete with it. And that's what we want to see. So are you seeing that at the governmental level within your organisation? I know you have all kinds of members, but you have 90 countries as well, Angela. One piece of very, very big positive legislation can lead to a virtuous circle, can't it?
You're seeing the US changing its enabling regulatory environment to facilitate the flow of more money into clean solutions, right? That's what you're seeing. You're seeing Europe responding. You're also seeing the Middle East and Asia doing exactly the same. But, it's where the media attention falls. They get a lot of stories about how it's doom and gloom and it's the end of the world. We've really got to change that dynamic. I want to be a little bit sobering, though. There is no way you detach the market from politics in energy, ever. You don't just have geopolitics, you have sociopolitics as well, right? The local politics as well. And the realistic is we're going to have a blended mix of state and markets working through this. And those are going to take very lumpy forms in different parts of the world. So the collaboration itself, the reality is most of the organizations that are doing this were designed for the 19th century, and we're facing a 22nd century problem. And it's going to come down also to how we reorganize institutions. We need institutional innovation, not just policy innovation and technology innovation. And the other bit is there's no getting away from the change that's involved. It's about behaviors, and it requires new values to be in place. So we've got social innovation we've got to manage. At the moment, I see a lot of conversations about markets and technologies and financing, but nothing about people. And there's 10 billion people need to be in this game.
You're spot on, of course, but my goodness me, look, the horrendous, awful war on the European continent showed one positive thing that I can think of, and that is actually Europeans can conserve a vast amount of energy when they put their mind to it. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I think it was up to a 20% decline in our consumption of natural gas on the continent because we'd suddenly decided we didn't need to have the heating on so much. We didn't need to travel so much as well. But going to our corporate representatives, and I'll start off with Andy on this one as well. The positiveness that can come from a good piece of legislation has been very well exhibited, certainly for the amount of money going into the United States. And I'll come to Mark on this one a little bit later on as well. But in terms of where you put your limited capital, because even with a company that's a behemoth like Diageo, you have a lot of capital to allocate. You've got to work out where to do it. Positive legislation, collaboration with governments, with good government, this can really act as a great catalyst, Andy.
Absolutely. I mean, we've committed $1 billion to our transition between now and 2030, and obviously it's critical that we leverage that in the right places in the right way. Part of that is about the scale of impact that we can have, but clearly part of it is about the enabling landscape within those different markets. Part of that comes from policy and regulation. Part of it comes from the collaborative opportunities, and again, back to Angela's point, the kind of social kind of impact and engagement levels within those. So, for example, for us on our packaging side, our supply base is relatively consolidated. But if you looked across our raw material supply, we have a very diverse range of supply interests, which range from large aggregators, cooperatives, right through to smallholders. So again, finding effective ways in which we can engage them, inspire them, and enable them to drive that transformation or be part of that transformation is critical. Part of that's about how we invest, but part of it again comes back to those local socioeconomic levers and also the policy levers within those markets as well.
And yes, you made a great point about buildings, but I'm going to put it back to what is your domain. And this isn't just about technology. It's not just about swanky new legislation. This is about food systems. It's about the quality of our soil. It's about how we use our soil. And this is something that's absolutely very important for Diageo and its sourcing of raw materials as well. There is a whole area where if we used our land better, the land we have, and Yussi's talking about the buildings we have, then we're going to make real progress anyway, regardless of what kind of energy we're using.
Absolutely. I think from my perspective, clearly we've invested heavily into reducing the footprint of our own operations, but a really significant proportion, so 90% of our overall footprint sits in our beyond operations. So principally in terms of upstream supply. So the more we can do to both reduce that footprint directly, through more effective use of inputs, but also looking at how we can leverage nature-based solutions as part of that is crucial. But to do that, and this is where we're really focused, is about how we help those farmers, those land managers, to step into that transition. Although the practices are relatively straightforward, it's very different from what many of them have been used to doing. So we have to help them make that transition, support them through that transition, and then as a result of that, enable them to benefit from that transition as well. Yeah. So it's a significant change. The practices are straightforward, but the engagement of our suppliers, of our farmers, of our land managers to make that transition is crucial. Yeah.
I'm just going to come to Yussi next. We've talked with Mark from the $1 trillion we've breached already, which is an enormous benchmark, getting to the $4 trillion. What is a catalyst for a company like Cornet to actually spend more money and to work with its customers to spend more money? Is it as simple? I say simple, it wasn't simple. Is it literally getting the right kind of legislation? And again, the aforementioned IRA?
In the big picture, it is a huge part of it, like regulation that enables these ecosystems of companies and these supply chains to work in a unified way. Even within the EU, there's still a lot of work to do with uniform regulation. France has their own database where the supply chain, we must provide data for our carbon footprint. Imagine if every EU country had their own database where everyone would have to, like even big companies like Kone, would have trouble, and we'd be spending so much energy just filling out these different databases and submitting information. So this needs to happen, of course, on a bigger scale. But just like as a last point about science-based targets, so Andy mentioned this, is that, but if you had asked me like in 2019, let's say September 2019, that, do you know what science-based targets are? I would have said like, yeah, okay, they sound familiar. But then if you'd asked me like, do you know what scope 1, 2, and 3 are? I would have said, I have no idea. But like less than a year since that, so in September 2020, we had externally validated science-based targets for scope, in 1, 2, and 3. But the big deal is like Andy mentioned, that scope 1 and scope 2, so our own operations, it's a very small part, simple and fairly small part of our operations. But then when we look at the upstream, how we can reduce the carbon footprint of the steel that we use, or of the different components that we use to build elevators, escalators, we need so much upstream collaboration. We need better unified regulation for the big companies, and then of course all the smaller suppliers for those big companies, and then of course the downstream, so managing the energy efficiency and the energy use of the buildings. And as an anecdote, we, depending on who we sell our elevators to, that can have an impact on our scope 3 emissions, because if we sell to a customer and the customer decides to use fossil fuels to power those elevators, to electrify those elevators, then that's bad for our scope 3. So it's kind of hard to control the whole chain.
It's great that you brought in SBTs as well, because Mark, it's bewildering for me. So is it bewildering for you as someone who's looking for concrete benchmarks as well? I mean, all the index providers, the MSCI will provide me an index of how green companies are. You've got all your Millennium Development Goals or UNDGs as well. You've got ESG targets, which is broader as well. But do you find if you're looking for a benchmark to judge an investment and how sustainable it is, and how there's too many benchmarks, Mark, and we actually need something a bit firmer to kind of put our flag on the mast of?
It's certainly critical that there's objectivity, transparency, and confidence in the green credentials of those things that represent themselves to be green. We're in a slightly special position because from our inception in 2012, we've always had our own green principles and our own green ratings methodology, and that's built into everything we do. We can't deploy unless we've done that analysis, and our methodology is public. There's huge pressure on this. We will lose momentum in our transition if there is a big moment of a crisis in confidence in the way things are being accounted for as green. We have our own methodology that we're very comfortable with, and it's scrutinised by our Green Purposes company that exists to scrutinise us. So we feel as though we're well positioned, but we're watching that very carefully. I'd be very interested to hear what Angela has to say about that.
Okay, so we're living in a world where we have a soup of indices, and we're all trying to clarify the soup. For 20 years, we've been promoting what we call the World Energy Trilemma Index, which is it's not a database, it's a GPS system. How do you navigate forward? How do you know if you're on the right track? How do you know if you're heading in the right direction? You can't manage energy transition using one metric. You can't just manage it using carbon dioxide emissions, because as we've seen, the crisis in Europe was a crisis of security. So you've got to manage energy security, energy affordability and equity, and sustainability through this. And this process lasts decades. So, we want people to step up and become trilemma titans, not just net zero heroes, because otherwise we'll just keep swinging from one crisis to another. And we're going to have to declutter the market. We can't have all these different indices. We've seen the ESG market come into play, but we've seen more E than S and G in this, right? S and G are weak compared to the E. So we need more balanced and integrated indices. So my invitation to the other guys is, come on, step forward, be trilemma titans. Let's have a global reference point, which is flexible and usable, not just by countries, but by companies and cities.
Andrew, this is moving on to the actionable stage, so that's great. So just before Jussi comes in, come on, give me something concrete I can cling on to, that how we are going to declutter this. And I agree with you, it is cluttered. I'm confused by the number of benchmarks and new benchmarks. And Mark Carney gave me several more in Glasgow, but I'm confused. There's too many. I want a global benchmark. How do we get there?
I mean, there's a big competition for convening, and it's not being helped by companies spinning up their own things or pretending that they're the United Nations and somehow they can convene neutrally. I'm seeing it all over the place. And my message to you guys is I'm a not-for-profit. I've been going for 100 years and I am being out-competed by you guys. This is nonsense. We've got to have some common ground spaces which are protected. I've got a tragedy of the common, at the energy commons going on, and I'm fighting to keep some of our independent metrics and tools and processes going because there's so much corporate and governmental co-opetition at the moment.
Jussi, jump in.
Cheers, thank you. And I hear the challenge from Angela. I wrote it down, but I would challenge back a little bit that you said that E is strong and S and G are not. Well, even the E is there's a lot of focus on the carbon balance, the carbon budget, where we are of sinks and emissions. But now, of course, there's increasing talk about all the other planetary systems which require our attention, of which climate is an important one and has knock-on effects on the others. But there should be more talk about, of course, biodiversity, about the different water systems, freshwater, acidity, nitrogen, and phosphorus and whatnot. And of course, these are very difficult because we don't know what we're even measuring. We don't know about what causes what the effects are and what the cross effects are. But it doesn't mean that we can ignore them until we've dealt with the climate issue, of course. But sort of going back to what companies want, and I'd love to, of course, hear if how Andy feels about this. But I mean, companies, as a general rule, they're not against like stricter regulations. They want a level playing field where the same rules apply, and then we will work under those rules. So it's really the problem is of collaboration.
Andy, I think the challenge was you to pick up the baton there.
Absolutely, and pick up on a couple of points there from Jussi. So I think the first one, absolutely aligned in terms of going beyond just carbon. So I think, again, there tends to be this colloquial acceptance of when talking about climate, we're talking about carbon. The reality is we're facing into multiple challenges around climate, around nature, around people. And if we take that approach and think about it on a much more integrated basis, it drives real opportunities, not only in terms of driving a more balanced set of outcomes, but also about driving much greater economic efficiency in terms of how we invest in those solutions and deliver a range of multiple outcomes. And if that's the case, that really enables us to accelerate pace and scale, which is clearly what the IPCC report's calling for. So I think driving that combined or that integrated approach is absolutely crucial, and one that progressively more and more businesses are starting to realise. I think the other thing is it also provides a real opportunity for greater collaborative investment. So we've been working very closely in terms of leveraging the Landscape Enterprise Networks model, which helps organisations on a cross-sector basis understand where the dependencies are and then come together to co-invest on a stacked investment basis into delivering those outcomes, putting the communities and the farmers, land managers at the centre of that decision making. So being very locally relevant and driving optimal social outcomes as well. So that's really, really positive for me. And I think to Jussi's point, that enables business to come together in a really effective way and really optimize how we're positioning our investment around that.
I'm going to do a final round before we wrap up here as well. And I'm going to start where we began, and then I'm going to try and move it on as well. So in one question, I have two parts. What are, for all of you, the greatest challenges to our goals? And I think we've established a lot of what our goals are here as well. And how can they be overcome? You can use your own organisation's standpoint, or you can look at it from a global point of view. And why don't I start off with Andy?
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge to the earlier point, we're seeing a lot of organisations and entities leaning in, but there are still a lot of organisations and entities who aren't yet leaning in. And it's really the challenge around how we engage, inspire and enable those different actors to play an active role to accelerate the change. In terms of how we do that, I think from our perspective, industry, Diageo as part of that, we have a crucial role in terms of how we can engage those different partners across our supply chain, not just the big actors, but those smallholders, those SMEs, those cooperatives, to help understand the role they can play, the benefits that playing a role can deliver, and the benefits of collaborating together to drive that change.
Jussi, why don't you jump in?
Sure. So, as we can hear, we're not short on challenges, but I'd say that the big challenges, I want to go back to what Angela said, and I agree wholeheartedly that we're dealing with institutions that were set up and cemented hundreds of years ago. We thought that, there's no way that we can make a difference on a planetary scale. This inherent slowness and inertia that's there, including but not limited to the sort of inbuilt inertia of politics, that's the big challenge, is how we can move and regulate fast enough, so that we sometimes will break a few things, but that will go into the right direction while still maintaining that it is a just transition. And this brings me to the great opportunity. And I think that is back to what Steve said earlier on how the Europeans realized that, hey, we can actually consume 20% less gas if we just decide to do that. So there is this latent energy in people, and there are 10 billion or soon to be 10 billion people, and then there's energy within those people for this change. But we have to find ways to unleash it so that everyone feels they're on board, everyone feels that this is a just transition.
Mark, why don't we get a final comment from you on the challenge that you're seeing?
In the established technologies, there is so much momentum and confidence in the markets to make this happen. But we need to clear the blockers, the things that slow down the moment in time when investment happens. And government's got a huge role to play in that. We need to get permits much more quickly, and we need to see real vision and incisiveness in bringing transmission grid, huge challenge, and really a speed limit for how all of that pent-up capability that we have to deliver electricity through wind and solar it should be there for us. When will we have it? It's the grid that tells us when. Then the other part is the newer technologies. If we look at what happened in the established technologies, the governments they gave those technologies a push and have achieved a huge dividend. The decline in cost and the volume impact of those older technologies that we see now and take to some extent for granted was achieved because they were given a policy push, a subsidy push, let's be direct, a financial push. And those newer technologies, all of which we need, every one of those new categories of activity in the energy transition needs to play out pretty much to the full theoretical capability of it as a technology. And we need them to happen sooner rather than later. And there are specific financial interventions that governments around the world can make to accelerate those things. And the dividend, again, for that will be huge. The US has shown the way with the IRA. We need to see that from governments everywhere.
And final comments from Angela.
I mean, I have a simple narrative, which is humanizing energy transition. And the reason for that is, if we're really going to make this change happen, we're really going to have to move away from these narratives of fear of the future to enabling more people to see opportunity and benefit for themselves at every level of society. We have technologized this debate, we have financialized this debate, but we have yet to humanize it. And believe me, it's hundreds of thousands of smaller steps rather than a great big technology leap or a financial leap that's really going to make the progress. So that's where I'm at.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the need for trilemma titans to clearing out the blockers to decluttering benchmarks and the need for better collaboration, especially in investment. So once again, I would like to thank all of our panelists for joining today. Jussi Herlin, the Vice Chair of the Board at Kone Corporation. Angela Wilkinson, thank you, Secretary General and CEO at the World Energy Council. Andy Griffiths, it's been great to get your view. You, of course, are the Head of Sustainable Procurement at Diageo. And really good to hear where the money is flowing from Mark Dooley, the Global Head of the Green Investment Group at Macquarie Asset Management. Thank you very much again for what I believe has been an insightful assessment of our global progress and the priorities for achieving net zero.